Representative Louis Gohmert from Texas, a Republican, filed a lawsuit against Mike Pence in a bid to overturn the election results. Tell us about that, Rick. It seems a little counterintuitive.
Sure. The lawsuit is something that's kind of been in the works. It is also being joined by the Arizona Republican electors, as well as a number of other members. But in short, what the suit does is it allows the vice president to solely, at his discretion, determine which of the electoral college votes should count and which should not count. That's
But why would it be? Why would it be a lawsuit against him? He's on our side in this thing. I don't understand.
No, it's not a lawsuit against him personally. It's a lawsuit against him as a individual in the process. So take the individual out. It's the way that the process plays out. Right now, the Constitution does not provide for any description or measure of what the vice president's role is in this January 6th process. Some people have interpreted that the vice president has sole discretion. Other people have said, no, it's a ceremonial duty. All the vice president does is open the envelopes and count the votes. That is what is at the heart of the matter. How much power does the vice president have in the process? The framers were afraid that a sitting vice president or somebody that was in the process of being reelected might have too much power if it ever came to this, which is why they instituted something called the Electoral Count Act in 1887. And this was about 10 years after the controversial election in 1879, where there were a number of states that submitted electoral votes, and the sitting individual at the time tried to remove some of those votes, and it created a huge issue with respect to Congress and what Congress's powers are in this process. So, in short, what this lawsuit is going to do, it's going to put us on an uncharted path that we've never been on before. So imagine now the courts, never having to rule on something of this nature, are going to have to determine whether or not the vice president constitutionally is the sole individual that counts the votes, and at his discretion can determine whether or not electoral votes can be added or dismissed. And why this is important, Jerry, is because you remember on December 14th, when all the electoral votes were being counted, a number of Republican electors also wanted their slates submitted, which constitutionally they have to do, even though that state wasn't won by Republicans. But what it did, it preserved the right for the opportunity for the vice president in this very situation to count those Republican electors as opposed to the Democratic electors. And remember, the most important provision, it's not about getting to 270. If they can keep Joe Biden from getting 270, then they accomplish the same goal. And then what happens at that point is, as you know, we've discussed on your segment before, this goes to the House of Representatives to determine who the next president of the United States is going to be. So
okay, it's been 133 years without being tested. And the law that went on the books in 1887 is about to get tested, I think. What's the odds of the lawsuit going fast enough to actually not go past any deadlines necessary? Does it get any higher priority because of the circumstances?
Well, depending on the nature of the suit and based on what I read from Congressman Gohmert's suit, it is a very factual, well laid out case in terms of constitutional law. So, January 6th is the date, but you have January 6th to January 20th before, a new president is sworn in. And so you have roughly 14 days. And look, this is one I know we've talked about before too, the Supreme Court trying to dodge, various lawsuits and not get involved. Unfortunately, this is one that's right in their strike zone. They're going to have to address it simply because no higher court in the nation has ever addressed this before. And in essence, they're going to have to determine what the powers, obviously, and they're going to have to, subject to interpretation, what the powers of the vice president are in this process. It's going to be very, very intriguing to see.
Now, is it coming from Representative Gohmert or coming from a state? Because the Supreme Court would have to take it directly without going to the lower courts if it came directly from a state.
Well, I guess my sense is that more people are jumping onto this by the day. So, Congressman Gohmert was the first one to get it out there. But as I said, the state of Arizona, the Republican electors in that state have jumped on board, and a number of other individuals. I suspect that there will be a state or two that jumps on it. In fact, Louis Gohmert filed his suit in Texas. So that is where it'll start its process. Right,
Texas.
exactly.
They're waiting for their comeuppance now because
Yes.
they got
But
jilted last time by the Supreme
right.
Court.
But this is exactly where, look, the judicial process is not about truth. It's not about fact. It's about legal maneuvering and legal process. This is why in most of the key battleground states, even though you had a Republican legislature or in a lot of cases where, people believe that Donald Trump won, but you had Democratic judges, those judges voted subjectively. I don't think I've seen a direct factual opinion laid out yet by any of the states, any of the judges, and certainly the Supreme Court has done everything they can do to dodge any decision making because they just don't want to get involved in it.
All right, talking about courts, the Constitution's 12th Amendment contains the exclusive dispute resolution mechanism over elections. Tell us about that a little bit more.
Absolutely. So this is what the framers put in place because of the election of 1879 when there were issues with how the votes were counted. And it created a huge constitutional crisis. And in that election, it took a number of votes, I think 32 vote counts in total, before the House actually selected a president. And it put a lot of people, in the mindset of this, our nation could be in peril by not having a constitutionally mandated president. So the 12th Amendment was put in place to govern and guide the process by which states are used to count the electoral votes and to make sure that the electoral votes are counted fairly and transparently. And that's exactly what we're getting to at this moment.
Okay, let me just play the devil's advocate for a minute. What would happen if Pence got this authority and we set a precedent and some future Democrat vice president were to try to test the limits of this thing and say, okay, we just got wiped out by Republicans. Republicans got like 500 electoral votes and we barely got any. Could he come and say, oh, I just decided to give it to the Democrats? I mean, does it have to be intolerance, a certain range, or could he do anything he wants to?
Well, that's what's up for debate. I mean, at this stage, what the scope of the lawsuit, and I think it is very smart for Congressman Gohmert to focus on one aspect of it. Unlike other lawsuits where you're just challenging the constitutionality of the electoral process, this actually hones in on one specific element, and that is the role and responsibilities of the vice president. What is he technically allowed to do? And in theory, if the courts interpret it that the framers wanted him to have excessive power or reduced power, then all of those kind of ideas that you just mentioned are going to fall into one of those two categories. So you could find, and this is a significant ruling, not just for 2020, but for future elections to come, because it may put into place another mechanism where we understand and have a more clearly defined process for the vice president as his acting role as Senate of the president in this constitutional electoral vote count. So it has.
Yeah, they might actually have to have a constitutional amendment on this one eventually.
Well, it is interesting. A lot of legal scholars say while there was a lot of thought put behind the 12th Amendment, and it obviously was done with careful consideration and thought, the Electoral Count Act was not. And it is being viewed as very ambiguous, unintelligible, and it was almost like it was a patchwork to try to fix things that had come up, since the framers had started the constitutional process.
Right, but they also have a phrase called executive. They don't. 133 years ago, they said it's up to the executive from the state. Who do they mean? Do they mean the governor? I don't think so. Do they mean one out of the 50 state electors and this newly convened House that we'll see shortly, which is very different than the 535 electoral House. So yeah, I mean, what is your thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. So the idea of an executive, it does define, the governor in that role. However, each state has its own roles and responsibilities with respect to how the electoral process unfolds, which is why we've gotten into a quagmire of issues in various states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, et cetera. So it's subject to interpretation. And this, again, is where the subjectivity of it is now the heart of the issue. And again, without a doubt, because it involves the 12th Amendment, because it involves a presidential race, I don't see how the Supreme Court gets around not, getting involved in this one, particularly because nobody has provided an opinion on it. So at the end of the day, who has the power? Is it the vice president? Is it Congress? Is it Congress in its capacity overseeing the electoral, count? in this election. So there's more unknowns in this so far than probably anything we've seen, as this process has unfolded. So
Okay, let's talk about the other elephant in the room. We got plenty of House members willing to challenge here, but do we even have one single senator yet at this point who's committed to July? Well, it's less than 2 weeks away to the January 6th issue here. I mean, couldn't this whole thing be over in minutes or in hours if we don't have at least one senator to step up to the plate?
Well, yes and no. On the aspect of objecting or opposing electoral votes, yeah, it requires one senator and one House member. To answer your question, there are 3 senators that have indicated they might, get involved. However,
Well, I don't understand it. Why wouldn't somebody like Ted Cruz just commit early? I don't
well, look,
understand
I
it.
think the senators, to a large extent, they're there for 6 years. A lot of them have been there for a while. They're probably more pragmatic. They want to see how this unfolds. And so I don't think they're going to commit right away. They still got plenty of time. And certainly in our current environment, if it looks like you're going one way or the other, I mean, half the American public's against you and throwing death threats around. So I think everybody wants to be careful here about what they do, exactly why the Supreme Court hadn't gotten involved. But to go back to answer the second part of your question, what Louis Gohmert is proposing is separate and distinct from what we were just talking about in terms of one senator and one House member. It is a completely different process. It's a completely different lawsuit. And it is now, kind of divulges into 2 additional paths that that President Trump has to challenge the current election results.
Okay, if he succeeds and gets it up to Supreme Court, it's likely Trump would be our next president. On the other hand, is there any way that the House or the Senate could get involved? I mean, we always have checks and balances, like 50% to vote on so and so, or 2/3 on such and such. What would the process be on a judicial matter like this? Is there any option for the House or Senate to intervene to kind of short circuit it so it doesn't go to the Supreme Court?
So at this stage, the only option that the Congress has is to pursue this path of having one member from the Senate, one member from the House, which has nothing to do with the courts. That's all settled within the congressional body. And in that manner, we talked about a scenario where if you delay and oppose enough of the electoral vote count to January 20th, then the mechanism that is used to resolve the presidency is the House of Representatives.
But clarify it. It's not the House that we know. It's a good House that would be Republican dominated. Is that correct?
That is correct. It goes to one state, one vote, and the states are based on the electoral, counts within those states. So if it's a Republican dominated state, then that goes to one Republican vote.
And who would be the caretaker president if it's not resolved by noon on January 20th?
That's a great question. In short, what you're probably going to end up with is acting President Nancy Pelosi, which some fear more than President-elect Joe Biden. There's a constitutional process that would allow the Senate to potentially appoint Mike Pence as the acting president, but there are a whole number of procedural matters that are required. And given the kind of toxic environment, I don't see any way that the Democrats in the Senate are going to allow that. Which means that we're going to be in limbo. If we're in limbo, then Nancy Pelosi becomes acting president until it can get resolved.
Wow. I mean, and the weird thing is, I mentioned this before, I think you have too, if Nancy Pelosi were to become president, even if it's for 1 minute, she has to resign, not only as House Speaker, but from the House of Representatives altogether. So she might be president for a day and not a congresswoman the next day.
Correct. And one other quick thing to throw at you and your viewers is, at the end of the day, there is now a movement to remove Nancy Pelosi as Speaker before we even get to January 6th.
Yeah, and the weirdest thing about that is on January 3rd, when they get the new Speaker, correct, if they get a new Speaker there, it could be somebody who's not even a congressman. They could be the dog catcher. There's no rule on that. You could literally make anybody the Speaker, and then just days later, that random person, the dark horse that everybody likes, a good old boy or a good old gal that is not so high profile that people fight over, all of a sudden becomes president of the United States for at least a few hours or a few days.
Yeah, there could be some quite interesting things, and why not? It's still 2020, so we still have a few days to come up with really outrageous things like the whole year has been.
Well, we're going to blink, Rick, and it's going to be past New Year's. It's just about now. A lot of things get resolved very quickly. The $2,000 stimulus just got voted by the House, went from $600 up to $2,000. And ironically, as we discussed off camera, President Trump is having a harder time with Republicans and Democrats and getting that $2,000 payment to the people. And I guess his thinking is, hey, if we're forcing the businesses not to be open, we're forcing people not to work, got to give them something. So it's really an inside out, topsy-turvy world right now. It's not just black and white anymore, is it?
Not at all. The president's always going to do what he believes is right, no matter if it flies in the face of Republicans or Democrats. And he's been consistent in that approach from the time that he ran his campaign in 2016 all throughout his administration. He does what he thinks is right, not what is popular or prevalent at the time, but he goes with his instincts, and his instincts on the stimulus were absolutely correct. Why are you giving money away to foreign countries as opposed to giving it to your own citizens? And the president,
10,000, 10 million. I can't even wrap my head around it. $10 million for gender studies in Pakistan as part of the COVID relief bill. I mean, who thinks of that stuff? It sounds like we're making it up, but it was in there.
It's a great example of where politics pollutes the transparency in government. And this is exactly what he was fighting against. Politicians typically doing what they do because nobody's going to care, right, about $10 million going to Pakistan or $10 billion of debt being wiped off the United States Postal Service. Nobody's
I don't know. I mean, a 5,500-page bill. I mean, I could read it between lunch and dinner, can't you? I mean, give me a break. Why do they do those things? Couldn't they have just had a 1 or 2 page bill that says everybody gets $2,000 and forget about all that pork?
Well, that's exactly it. That's the point President Trump's trying to make. If you're focused on a stimulus bill, sure, there are multiple aspects, individuals, companies, et cetera. But the idea is you're helping the American people. That bill has so much ridiculous aid for non-Americans and non-American interests that it goes to question, what are these members of Congress doing? I mean, what are they? I mean, for God's sake, even Mitch McConnell is putting in an independent horse racing commission into the bill. You know, how does that factor into, you know, whether or not Americans get $600 or $2,000? So this is where the president is fantastic at showing how far off the mark Congress is and has been for decades. And this is why you've seen such a resistance to him over the last 4 years.
Well, Mitch McConnell's been no friend of Trump lately. I mean, he's acting like Biden's the president, and he's not even seemingly wanting to fight.
Well, it's politics as usual. This is exactly, you know, my point. I mean, people dislike politics. They dislike politicians. It's exactly why President Trump was elected in 2016, and frankly, he was elected in 2020. But obviously, that's up for debate right now. But at the end of the day, this is it. I mean, we as an American public, as American voters, need to hold our individual representatives more accountable. The president did a great job of exposing the corruption and the shenanigans and all of the politically ridiculous tactics that they use. But now it's up to us as voters to hold these people accountable. I mean, we've got to find a better mechanism than people that just go up to Washington, get comfortable, and are used to following a system and a process that doesn't work for the United States of America.
Swamp creatures on steroids. That's all it is. Republican, Democrat, once they get in their beltway for a while, I don't know what they put in the drinking water or in the reflecting pool that evaporates, but something changes people, including Supreme Court justices sometimes. Alito was rock solid. Clarence Thomas is rock solid. I'm hoping Amy is fine, but man, Roberts has not necessarily been the conservative we thought he was. It's just something about, maybe it's the air in Washington. Anyway, we're up against the clock here. Thank you again, 2016 Deputy Campaign Chairman for Donald Trump, Rick Gates. It's been a pleasure as always.
Good to be with you, Jerry.